Okay, awesome. Sweet. Thank you for bearing with me through that entire thing. That was a deal. For those people that are listening to this whenever they get to it, we just had like probably about a half hour issue there where we couldn't get any audio working and ended up forcing Tom to get on his phone. So thank you for dealing with all of
We did it. We overcame it. It was
that.
beautiful.
And now you're holding it up with the stapler.
And my roll of tape. Don't leave out my roll of tape.
Roll of tape.
So
Awesome. Sweet. Well, thank you for coming on. I'm sorry to have made your life potentially more hectic by having you run across town just to be able to get on.
no, no, it's all good. It's a hectic time of year, but it's kind of exciting, hectic, and this year has really been phenomenal on the hill for outdoor recreation and conservation. I mean, it's not done until the bell strikes on that last day, but it's been kind of a fun, hectic.
That's awesome to hear, especially just because from all of the constant different like inundation from different news sources and people and all of these different things going on in the outdoor industry, especially within Utah. It's cool to hear that that's, how you feel about how it's all playing out.
Yeah, for sure.
So, could you just do a quick little introduction of who you are and what you do, and then we'll go from there.
Yeah, so my name is Tom Adams. I'm the director for Utah's Office of Outdoor Recreation. We were the first office in the nation, which is kind of a cool thing to be able to wave our flag loud and proud for that. But more importantly, it's great that a lot of other states have followed suit and created kind of their own office and kind of molded it to what fits them best. But here in Utah, our mission is to ensure Utahns can live a healthy, active lifestyle through outdoor recreation, and it's our model that if we can do that, everything else will follow. People will be healthy and healthier and happier. They'll be out recreating. They'll tell their friends. People will buy second homes. Businesses will move here, and all the things we've seen happen over the years. Um, and we have four things we're asked to do through legislation, which is important because our office was created through legislation. So that means we're here no matter what, as long as legislation wants to keep us. We don't change with governors as things change. So we're here to help with policy. We're help to build and create recreation infrastructure. We're here to help with corporate recruitment, so bringing outdoor businesses here. And then last but not least, inspire Utahns to recreate, especially youth. So really, we have a lot of things to do, and we're a small but strong team of four, and we're pretty thrilled to be doing what we're doing.
Totally, and that's an awful lot to handle with a state that has so much outdoor stuff going on.
Yeah, I mean, 60%, 67% of our state is federal and public land. So that's state parks, that's BLM, that's national parks, that's national monuments, which a lot of people don't know. Some national monuments are managed by national parks, the Department of Interior, and some are managed by the Bureau of Land Management, the BLM. And it is really confusing figuring it all out, but we have amazing partners throughout the state, and that's what makes us successful. I just got off the phone earlier today with the state director for the BLM, Ed Robertson, and we just had a great conversation about what's going on with the new public lands package, and he's got. We joking that he has a lot of job security now here in Utah. So
That's awesome. And I would love to get into more of that. But where I wanted to start was with a little bit more of your background, just because we had talked about briefly was you being at Petzl for a little while and coming from a background of like being a little bit more immersed in that scene within a couple of different outdoor companies and then ending up with where you're at today in office. How did that all transpire?
well, it all started with a school dance trying to take girls rock climbing in high school, right?
And the
you know,
rest is history.
it kind of is from there. Like I did so many jobs in the outdoor industry. I started as a ski instructor, a peer instructor at Brighton Ski Resort. I even cleaned bathrooms at Recreation, which was an old gym here in Utah, and I made cams in the manufacturing lab and Black Diamond. So I did a ton of things, enough jobs that I had family members like, you need to settle down and find yourself a real job, Tom. Like we need to figure this out. And lo and behold, one job turned into another. And, my last career piece was with, not Black Diamond, but with Petzl, where I was the sales director for North America. And that really, the growth Petzl had seen over those last 8 years I was there made a great transition piece to come work for the state because I was really in tune with recreation and growing up here in Utah. But then I was also in tune and could see it through the lenses of a great business and expanding here in Utah too. And it made a really good fit for me, fortunately.
Yeah, because Petzl is a family-owned company. Am I right?
Yeah, Petzl's a family-owned company by Paul Petzl and the Petzl family in France, and a phenomenal family that's running a business that, one of the few that hasn't gone public. And say what you want about doing it, it's good and bad, depends what lens you come through. But this is a family doing exactly what they want to do, and no one else steers the ship but the family. So it's pretty admirable.
That's great. So then coming through a couple of those different companies and really seeing things from pretty much the bottom up, what led you to wanting to get into the position that you're in now?
you know, Nothing really led me to coming to the state, to be honest. I never thought I would be in politics or work for the state. Everyone that knew me in the outdoor industry, especially at Petzl, said, "Oh, Tom is a lifer. He's not going anywhere." And luckily, I still have my toes in the water. But I had a day, had very few rough days ever at Petzl. To be honest, I really loved that company, and the same with the other companies I worked for too. But just progressed. And my wife's like, "Hey, you had a rough day. What would you do if you didn't work at Petzl?" And I was like, "Well, I don't know. I haven't thought about it for a while. It's something that wasn't on my mind because I had a great job, and really a dream job." And a couple of weeks later, I came back and said, "I think this Office of Outdoor Recreation is kind of cool," because it was the first office, and my predecessor, Brad Peterson, was in the role. And I'm not lying. 2 months later, my brother-in-law comes up to me and says, "Hey, Tom, I just heard this position is open. You should apply." I'm like, "Did you know I talked
Crazy.
about this with my wife?" And it was kind of a little bit of fate, serendipitous, but after hearing more about it, it really made sense because the industry is really important. But on the other hand, recreation and all the different recreation outlets we have was also important. And fortunately, I've been able to do a lot of them here.
That's great. So what was it like with the role switch there? Because obviously you're going from working to push more of the consumer side of a business, and then you're turning that into, what does a day look like in your shoes where you're at currently?
Yeah, so the transition was quite dramatic from what my predecessor was doing. Brad was, I mean, he had to be a road warrior. He had to get out on the road and meet a lot of people and let people know the office is even in existence and what we do.
Hmm.
And since then, we've added a grant in our office, the Utah Outdoor Recreation Grant, which gives us $5 million. So I get to go out and help, just as I helped retailers build their business. I would go to REI or backcountry.com or even some of the smaller shops here, like Wasatch Touring, you name it. I was in
Hmm.
there helping them kind of say, "Hey, how can Petzl help you?" And now we're just in a different role of how can Utah help you build recreation in your communities? Are you doing it for tourism? Do you want people to come here? Or do you not want any more people to come here and you just want to do it to have a healthy, active lifestyle? So that's one piece of the puzzle. And I get asked a lot, "Hey, what's the average day like?" And it's really dynamic. Some days might be talking about the grants. I mean, today's our deadline for the Utah Outdoor Recreation Grant, which we actually extended to Monday. We had so many people like, "We were trying, we can't get it in." But we deal a lot with corporate recruitment. I just got off the phone earlier today with a business that's moving from Europe to Utah, an outdoor brand, and racing to get here. I was just talking about policy on a new bill that's going through during the session. So it's really dynamic. It's really fun. And this time of year is incredibly fast paced.
Gotcha. So yeah, that's absolutely wild. So can you talk a little bit about the actual history of the the organization itself and what it was like coming into uh, being the next person in line? Obviously, you mentioned your predecessor, the person you came in after. What was it like stepping into that and getting up to speed on what's been going on in order to kind of start to look at what are we trying to do moving forward and how do I, start to take the next step?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So history is pretty interesting in it. We talk about this a lot with other states that they're creating an office because we just celebrated last July our 5 year anniversary. So the Office of Outdoor Recreation, as we know it today, is 5 years old. But prior to that, the 5 years prior, we had a recreation cluster director that was here within the Governor's Office of Economic Development. And his goal was really to foster relationships and help recruit businesses to Utah and support the businesses that were here. And quickly, what we learned over those I shouldn't say too quickly, but over those 5 years, we learned like, hey, this is much bigger than just
Mm-hmm.
corporate recruitment. It's about health and wellness in our communities. It's about building new infrastructure and helping those communities. It's about driving new policy of what we can do to help out these communities. And it's about helping to be a voice and protect and an advocate for public lands, no matter the user group, right? Because historically, outdoor recreation for me has kind of been climbing and skiing and running and kayaking, those maybe human powered things. And I used to work on a ranch as well, but we're here for hunting, we're here for fishing, we're here for off-roading, 4x4, timber bikes, snowmobiles, you name it. I mean, tomorrow morning at 7:40, we're running a bill with Representative Phil Lyman to create the first week of December as Avalanche Awareness Month.
Cool.
And that affects everybody from the folks driving up some of the canyons to snowmobilers to snowshoers. So we kind of cover everything. But that transition from Brad to myself um, was really, it gave me, Brad laying the foundation and helping people know who we are gave me the ability to still travel a lot, but now I can sit behind a desk, work with people, and get truly engaged in and action oriented things. And we have a funding source, which Brad never really had, where I can say, hey, we have money to help you do this. And that's a big deal. And over the last few years, you can't pick up a paper without reading something about public lands at least once a week. And we get engaged in those conversations a lot right now, being kind of that advocate for Utah and for our recreationalists and for our communities.
Mm-hmm. So
So,
what's it like been, obviously you were talking about being kind of the forefront of this with Utah as a state. What's it been like as a lot of these other states have kind of started to step up and form their own version of this? Like I know Colorado has that. I know California is trying to put it in place, but isn't quite there. And there's a couple more like Washington and some others. Like, do you frequently talk with people from those states on how they're trying to put this together? Because I'm assuming there's some learnings that you've gone through that other people are trying to potentially navigate in either in a different way or in their own way with their own sets of challenges.
yeah, there's a lot of reasons why it's great to have other states. So currently there's 8 states that we look at as the confluence states, or we signed these confluence accords a year ago at Outdoor Retailer, and 8 of our states and our governors came to the table and said, hey, these are the 4 values we have, and we're all going to stand for those. But right now there's roughly 8 more states that could potentially come out of this legislative session having an office of outdoor recreation, with New Mexico probably and Maine being hot on our heels to creating that. And there truly is strength in numbers. I mean, having us come here, it's bringing recreation to the forefront in a lot of states. And what it does, Utah, and I've spoken everywhere from Hawaii to France on why you should create an office of outdoor recreation. And it's phenomenal taking those trips, and twist my arm, I have to go ride bikes in France or go to Hawaii, right? But it's time away from our duties here in the state, and having more states doing this, it lets them tell their story and let other states relate to other structures. Because, for instance, here in Utah, we're in the Governor's Office of Economic Development, very similar in Colorado, but you go to Wyoming and they're part of state parks. Their state parks director is their Office of Outdoor Recreation. Same thing in Oregon. You go to Washington and he's an outdoor recreation advisor to the governor. So everybody's molding this position to fit best in their state. And it's nice to have those different examples because, man, we learn a lot from each other. And in fact, to your point, how much do we communicate? We're on a call about once a month. We go to trade shows quite a bit. There's a number of folks coming to the RVX trade show, which is the new RV show coming here to Salt Lake, March 12th through the 14th. And then this fall, we will most likely gather all of the offices of outdoor recreation around the nation after our outdoor summit in St. George, late October. So everybody will be here.
That's super cool.
Yeah.
So to get into things, you had mentioned briefly there a little bit about OR and a lot of the trade shows and stuff. And even before that, talking about how there's kind of all these different ways that these different public lands are set up and how they're structured, not just within Utah, but as you're talking about different people in different positions within different states. I think the best point or the best area to kind of kick that off would, or this portion of the talk off, would be to mention the whole piece with Patagonia and how that all ended up kind of coming down of them leading OR to end up switching to Denver from Salt Lake. How, like, for you stepping into that role, what sorts of things are you trying to pick up on, and how are things changing? And, leading up to that whole shift, what all is happening around that? And how are you trying to go about working with all these moving pieces?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Of course, the Outdoor Retailer Show is big here in Utah, and as someone coming from Petzl that basically managed everything at Petzl that had to do with the trade show.
Yeah.
It was pretty, it was earth shattering a little bit for businesses. And I think the trade show itself, it needed to be shaken up. It was here for 20 years.
Hmm.
I won't say it was stagnant, but people weren't evolving very much and they were kind of getting used to the routine. And it was definitely shaken up by moving it to another state. But when I put my Petzl hat back on, my outdoor industry hat, trade shows, whether it's in Utah or Colorado, have always kind of been under a little umbrella of, is this worth it? What are
Hmm.
we really gaining here? Because these big, huge trade shows, and you've seen it with Interbike, they're kind of dying because regional shows are right there in people's backyard. I'm going to send out, as working for Petzl, I would send my reps out and they would do it on their own to regional shows and visit shops all the time. They didn't
Hmm.
need to wait until January or August to see new products. They were seeing it early. They were writing orders. So by the time they came to these big outdoor shows, it was, if not anything, I think the most impactful thing was to see the mass of people in numbers supporting an industry. When it comes to writing hard orders and making an ROI case for your sales team, the big shows are hard. It's really hard to justify.
Hmm.
So,
Yeah. So yeah, and it's interesting that you brought up Interbike because I remember I'd worked for Hydropack for a little bit there, and they had gone out there, and I remember hearing that it was like half the show that it used to be, and then seeing OR move to Denver and kind of being combined with a lot of these other shows like SIA, you're starting to see a lot of it kind of you know dwindle, and it's only the big companies that have huge marketing budgets to kind of pour into that thing that can actually make it happen, because it's almost not worth it for the little guy anymore to try and make that happen. There's other ways of going about reaching uh, potential customers or partners to work with.
without a doubt, and that's where some of those regional shows come in. The nice thing about an outdoor retailer or an Interbike, when they're working well, they let a lot of smaller startup companies find a presence, and for the most part, all the major buyers in the country are there. So if you want to get picked up from a Wasatch Touring to a Neptune Mountaineering to a Rock and Snow about back east, or an REI or MEC, they're all there. And so you're getting that exposure, if not anything for the product, for the company, the brand, and they're going to see you over and over again. But Interbike, it, it it was, I think, a great show and a good concept. But as soon as Specialized and Trek and all those big companies pulled out because they have their own kind of shop and shop
Mm-hmm.
concepts or their own retailers, that's where the ROI really made sense. Like, we're going to take all these guys to Snowbird. We're going to have our dealer camp. We're going to write orders. They're all about Specialized in that case, and that's, we're seeing that happen. And even at summer outdoor retail or winter, we watched Arc'teryx not show up, Columbia not show up, Petzl didn't show up, and I can't tell you how many other people. And we've watched the show diversify too. Like, Dominetic coolers came, right? These kind of
Mm-hmm.
overlander coolers. They're phenomenal. They had a beautiful booth, and kudos to Outdoor Retailer for diversifying some of the companies that are there on the floor.
Yeah. Yeah, how interesting. And that's almost a completely different topic altogether, is how
Yeah.
like the direct to consumer model has affected the bike world in general, not just all of these outdoor brands, but it's been pretty crazy to watch, and then sometimes be even a little bit more close to, especially like with stuff like the whole Walmart thing where they put up a bunch of those brands on their like Specialized outdoor homepage, and the whole outdoor industry blew up.
Yeah, they did. I mean, when I watched Walmart buy Moose Jaw, I wasn't in the scene anymore. I just patiently waited to see what brands were going to
Hmm.
stick around, right, and how they're going to run it, because that's a really interesting merger and purchase. And the Walton family, to their to I will say to their credit, they've worked a lot with Ashley Kornblatt in Moab and Outer Bike, and they created another Outer Bike in Arkansas. And so there's some value there for outdoor recreation. But does the brand of Moose Jaw tell the same story as Walmart? And of course, it doesn't. And it's a struggle for them.
Hmm. Yeah.
So
So what's it like kind of being still within the industry, obviously, but dealing with a lot of this stuff going on in a different way, where you're almost like one step kind of removed from it? Because it seems like within the outdoor industry as a whole, if you're like the deeper you get, the less you're kind of allowed to say, just because it seems like you're so close to a lot of these brands that it's almost a taboo to um, say something outside of the norm or kind of talk about a move that some company made in a negative way. And now you're kind of like a little bit further back from that, and you're seeing it all kind of play out in front of you in a way that affects you, but you're not necessarily uh, your salary almost isn't like fully dependent on that. It's like, you know.
Right. Yeah, definitely not commission based at the state, and I don't know how we would do it, but it's what's interesting, and I'll to talk about kind of when the show left again, but not to talk about that. But if you were here for the march to the Capitol for Bears Ears, it was cool. There was roughly 2,500, 3,000 people that came to the lawn, but we're talking about a trade show that has 25 to 30,000 people. That was a drop in the bucket that marched up here. And
Hmm.
I think a lot of people maybe didn't care because they didn't know where Monticello or San Juan County is anywhere in the world, right? You couldn't pin it, and that's where Bears Ears is the home to. But more importantly, I was the same way. I was so focused on making Petzl better and stronger and helping my retailers. By the end of the day, when I went home at 7, I was not looking at the legislative calendar to see what's
Hmm.
going on. And that's where our office plays a pretty cool role. And I have great relationships statewide, and people have opened the door to me and said, "Hey, Tom, you took this job. We think it's a little crazy. You took this. Tell us more about what's going on." I can help to educate them and get them engaged. And I mean, we host a summit called the Utah Outdoor Recreation Summit, which is probably the largest state-based outdoor summit in the country. And REI is a sponsor, Outdoor Industry is a sponsor, Black Diamond's been a sponsor, Climate, Cotopaxi. There's so many brands that have been sponsors, and we get engaged. We talk about policy. We talk about everything that's happening, good and bad in the state, and think about good ideas. And that's fun to get this industry engaged. It's typically, as I joke, just selling carabiners sometimes.
Yeah.
So
Definitely. So, what is the overall landscape looking like now? Because it was interesting how I ended up stumbling onto your profile. I think what I end up doing is just kind of looking on LinkedIn for a while for people that have interesting backgrounds and seeing where it's taken them. And just I enjoy hearing different perspectives from people that end up getting into these interesting pieces of different industries. And yours was one of those. And I remember seeing like an image of a presentation that you had posted about the attendance of national parks just
oh
blowing
yeah.
up, and the staffing being worse, if not the same, than it's been. Um, what does this whole scene look like over the last couple of years? Because you're starting to bring in these heavy influencers through Instagram that are posting all this stuff about all this outdoor things, and you're getting brands that are trying to be more focused on advocacy, and it's like, it's just this crazy dynamic landscape, and now you're kind of at the core of watching all that play itself out.
Yeah, we're at the core, and some things you need to keep in mind, and maybe to back up a little bit. I'm glad that image caught your eye because I can remember the first time I heard that. I was talking to Jeff Bradybaugh, who's the superintendent for Zions National Park. I'm in a parking lot on a road trip in the back of my camper van, sitting on the back bed, just on this conference call. And I had to sit up. I'm like, "What's your budget?" And
Mm-hmm.
basically that slide for those people that are watching, listening. Zions National Park has the same budget today, in fact, a little bit less, 5% less roughly than they did in 2010, but they have double the population, hitting nearly 5 million visitors. So it might be something if you went from 100 to 200 visitors, but we're talking 2.5 million visitors to 5 million visitors and the same budget, now 9 years ago. I mean, if we all went through life and didn't get a raise for 9 years and we're doing more work, we'd probably freak out, right? And there's a lot of public lands folks here. I mean, during the government shutdown, I mean, people are working hard. They are sincerely sad to not be at work helping to do these things, and we get to see that firsthand in our office. So we work a lot with the federal land managers, and we get to partner with them, and we get to see them on their highs and lows. And unfortunately, we talk about lows. It feels like more because we talk about maintenance backlog and places that they need help and how can we help. But then there's highs like the folks that got financially supported from the state of Utah and the Office of Tourism. I mean, the folks in Zion National Parks and Arches were troopers for keeping it going on such a minimal staff during that month-long furlough.
Totally.
So,
Yeah, and another piece that I thought was interesting was I had seen someone post about it was an article somewhere, and I'm bummed that I don't remember where it was posted, but it had said that the amount of people coming to Joshua Tree in California um, that were coming into the park and essentially just trashing it, ruining all this stuff, that there was a potential that a good portion of that was never going to be recovered from. So,
yeah.
is there a little bit that you can talk about in regards to how that shutdown affected Utah and, the pros and cons of working through that entire thing?
Yeah, no, that it's a great question, and I'm glad you bring up Joshua Tree just to give them a shout out because they did have some devastating things happen. Some of them trees being chopped down that they talked about 300 years of damage, and some of it's really old Joshua trees
Hmm.
that a lot of people don't know are migrating out of the park just because of climate change. And Joshua Tree is probably one of my favorite places in the world. Truly, truly love it. And shout out to folks like Kenji Hartuni and the Friends of Joshua Tree because they did an amazing job helping out there. So a lot of volunteer labor. But what was different from places in California to Utah, statutorily, our office, we are we are we are ordered pretty much to say what parks would you open up and how during a furlough. So as soon as we know a furlough is coming or a potential shutdown, which unfortunately we got kind of good at it last year because there was 3 of them in the 1 year, right?
Wow.
So we
Ouch.
usually, I know it normally happens on a Friday, and we're prepping weeks out. But by the time that Wednesday comes, we have this list and we've given it to the governor, and we're like, hey, if this happens, this happens. And Vicky Varela, Dave Williams, Jay Kinghorn in our Office of Tourism, they came through strong. We said, here's how we think the park should be opened. They found some funding sources within the office, and they were able to fund. So a lot of people just said, hey, we're going to fund some rangers to drive around or whatever it might be. But in Zion, they funded the visitors center. They funded people to clean bathrooms. They funded kind of some key personnel. And for the most part, most people didn't realize that what was different about the park besides they didn't pay an entrance fee, and then we had companies like Alsco, so the uniform clothing company, probably seen their trucks drive around white with a big green logo. They came a little later in the game. Unfortunately, the furlough ended, but they ponied up $100,000 to keep parks open through the holidays because a lot of and here's the crazy part. Some people look at it as like, why are you guys enabling the federal government to open these parks?
Hmm.
Well, yes, to a point we're doing that, but what we're doing that we felt is more important is we're enabling our gateway communities to stay viable and vibrant during those times and stay open and make money, as well as, I mean, it was over the Christmas holiday and President's Day weekend. It's like people, they don't pay attention to when a park's closed because they think it's always open. And so
Hmm.
we had so many letters come into our office and the Office of Tourism, social posts where people like, thanks so much for doing what you're doing. We didn't even notice any changes. It was wonderful to be there. So, there's a definite, oh gosh, there's a responsibility we have to our gateway communities and the American public that's coming here.
Hmm.
So,
Yeah, so that brings me into the question of is do you think that that is potentially an issue of just education, or like why do you think that that people don't fully, either from more of a core, understand what's happening in regards to the park's opening and how much is going on behind the scenes to allow people to be there versus like, you know, how much of what you're seeing is people stepping up to the plate and really helping to keep those things open versus like the defacing kind of like destructive side of what that is. Because I think from a social media perspective, it's easy to latch onto a place like Joshua Tree not recovering for 300 years. But maybe what we aren't seeing is a lot of the people that are actually stepping up to make that situation better.
yeah, there were a few articles, I think, in the Trib or the Deseret News about, this heroic staff in Zion or Arches that was sticking out, but you didn't hear stories. You heard
Hmm.
stories about, you know, toilets in Joshua Tree that were thrashed or trees that have been chopped down or the poor family that lost a family member in Yosemite that fell off one of the waterfalls, I believe. Those are what people like to read about. I mean, it's
Hmm.
sad, and the story is not real prevalent of the Forest Service manager that just has his head down and just working really hard, right? They just, those stories don't get told. They need to be told more. Hopefully readers would be entertained by them too, or inspired. It's kind of like, what was that old book, something soup, where they had all these heartwarming stories,
Hmm.
right?
Chicken soup for the,
Chicken soup.
yeah, yeah.
Exactly, right.
That's funny. I haven't heard that one in a while.
I know, but it's kind of, there's a lot of those stories out there. And even a great example is, one of the partnerships. So we had a lot of snow during the Christmas holiday, basically all winter this year. But Zion or Arches had to close because they had too much snow. Well, they partnered with UDOT, and UDOT just went in there and plowed all the roads, and they just did it
That's awesome.
because, yeah. So there's some really cool partnership where there was some luck involved too in Utah that nothing bad happened. Things could have happened, and there's some folks that have a valid argument that, like, hey, we probably shouldn't open the park if we're not running at full capacity and protecting and preserving, which is the mission of the National Park Service. But that said, we came out looking pretty darn good here in Utah.
Yeah, that's incredible. It brings me to two questions, which is the first being, you mentioned funding for a little bit there. Is when something like that government shutdown happens, and even outside of the shutdown, just in general, I've seen a lot of kind of marketing efforts come from a lot of outdoor companies in regards to the fact that they're trying to be more of a steward to the outdoor community as a whole and really get people involved in either volunteering with some different places that help to restore, anything from trails to working within more of a local community to actually donating to try and help build a lot of this like camaraderie that's going on within outdoor spaces. Do you see a lot of that money coming from those places toward more of the park side of things, or is there kind of a disconnect with what a lot of these outdoor companies are doing and then what the parks are doing?
I think there's some disconnect. I think some of it, there's a lot of things we could talk about here in terms of the disconnect.
Mm-hmm.
Um, some companies, they don't want to get mixed up into it. Some of them really want to be loud and proud and have a story. And I think that's what this younger generation, including myself. I'm Gen X. Maybe I'm a hybrid from millennial and Gen X, but everywhere I've worked, it's somewhere I've fully believed in, and they've always supported community service in some aspect, whether it was working at Black Diamond and we'd go do trail work or help rebolt routes, or I was working at Liberty Mountain and we would do similar stuff, or same with Petzl. I mean, Petzl had basically a couple days every year to go do community service and get engaged. And if you did it 5 years in a row, you got like a 2-week trip to go do a bigger service trip. So there's those things. But again, I think there's the companies that recognize that their employees and their customers want to believe in that company. Those folks are being more successful. And you've seen that with Patagonia, right?
Mm-hmm.
Whether you support Patagonia's political stance or not, you can't deny the fact that people believe in that brand. And a lot of times it's that brand is as much as a statement as I'm outdoorsy these days as it is, I making a political stance for public lands. And good for them, because they've always had a passion for public lands and really just recreation in general, right? I mean, their catalog historically has always been something you wanted to grab and hold on to and look at because the imagery was so inspirational or aspirational.
Yeah. I thought that was such an interesting move recently to hear about them kind of shifting their pillars, and one of them being a lot more of a heavy focus on the politics side of things, just because I feel like that's such a polarizing thing to get into, and it's such a cutthroat at a higher level. It's such a cutthroat industry, or not necessarily industry, but um, just a space to be, because you start kind of arguing on all these facts, and it seems like people are just using information to try and make you look bad in the eyes of
Yeah.
someone else. And it just seems like, at least from my perspective, that was at the very least an interesting move, because it just seems like it's going to take so much resources, and uh, it just seems like it's almost detracting from what their overall potential goal is. I see obviously the benefit of being involved in that side of things, and obviously you do, working with the state. But it just seems like the difficulty there comes in the tit for tat, like, you said this, we didn't say this, kind of, like, where's the money going deal. Um, when you try to step up to the plate as a company versus the government almost.
Yeah, I mean, when you're in the public eye, people are scrutinizing left and right whether you do a good thing or you donate money and where it's going to. And Patagonia's been people have asked, okay, you're very ethical here, but you don't seem ethical here, and everybody's going to get pulled apart when they start entering that political arena. If depending who's in the group. But that said, I think folks like Patagonia, folks like REI, they're doing a lot of really good things in their community. And the reason I appreciate the efforts, especially the financial ones that they're making in the right arenas, is because outdoor equipment doesn't have any tax on it. And it's kind of wild. If you buy any fishing, hunting licenses, or you go buy a gun or ammunition, the manufacturers are paying the Pittman-Robertson tax, which I think is 11%.
Oh wow.
And Patagonia gave, I think Black Friday 2 years ago, or maybe this last year, they gave every penny, which was phenomenal, like $10 million to whatever organization it was. I mean, to take all that was really cool, I thought. But Vista Outdoors, that sells, federal firearms, they own Savage firearms. They paid $92 million by themselves through the Pittman Robertson. That all goes back to conservation projects where, I mean, the hat you're buying, the climbing shoes, the tennis shoes, whatever you might have, we're not paying any taxes on that. And maybe this is me as an older adult, but I'd be willing to pay that tax at the register if I knew where it was going. Maybe it's 10 cents, 50 cents, whatever on my climbing rope I buy, but I'd be willing to pay it. And, maybe I would have had a little different thought when I was in college or scraping by for, trying to get every quick draw I could for cheap. But I don't think it would have stopped me from climbing. I just would have found them in other places, right? I would have gone to a gear swap or something. But we really need to start talking seriously about who's using the places and who's helping to maintain them. Because growing up in Utah, I can guarantee you I firsthand took everything for granted. Climbing, all these outdoor things were in my backyard. They were always there, kind of this gift that I never had to worry about. And now seeing the masses go to these areas, I'm like, oh, wow, we need to start worrying about these things. We need to replace bolts and we need to make trails sustainable. But finding the money to do that is pretty hard for some groups.
And that's why one of the reasons why I wanted to have you on, because it seemed like you had a very eclectic mix of working for a lot of these brands and being able to see a lot of these difficulties firsthand, where I think a lot of people, what's happening in that space nowadays is like sports like climbing are starting to blow up. You're seeing it in Utah with all these huge climbing gyms starting to just, open up multiple locations all over the place. Like single route sport climbing, those crags are packed to the brim now. You can't show up to any of those spots without, having to wait in a line.
Yeah.
And it's a nice segue into my question of like, what are some typical misconceptions of people that are starting to take that dive into the outdoor scene because of something they've seen on Instagram or a beautiful place they've heard of, and now all of a sudden they're thrown into this world of who's managing this and what can you do on what land and where's all this money coming from? Like that's a big huge pool to all of a sudden just be thrown into.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of quiet, kind of selfless giving people out there in this state. I'll call out Petzl, Liberty Mountain, Goal Zero, Alta, Brighton, a lot of places that have land parcels or money that they've given out in large amounts that you've never even heard of. And I think a lot of us take it for granted when it comes to, especially to accessing those landowners, because I guarantee you, I can tell you about some land parcels that skiers have crossed 1,000,000 times and didn't know it was private property, but the owners are allowing them to do that. And we do that for so long. We kind of want to claim eminent domain. Like, how could you ever take that away from us? But it's private property and they've done that. And what I think is another naive thing for people is I love social media. Believe me, I love the images, but if you're a backcountry skier these days, you're looking at some of the coolest lines in the Wasatch that you've never seen, especially this year. And you're like, oh, that guy did it. I could go do it. I'm a better skier. But that guy might have AVI 3 certification and knows all the snow crystals and the science behind it, or that girl for that matter. I mean, I just was on a panel with Carolyn Gleick. I mean, she skied every chute in the Wasatch, and any guy out there that might pound his chest, like, I could do anything she can do. I was like, you might want to start paying attention because it's a
Yeah.
really risky sport in certain areas. So, and the same for climbing. I mean, climbing at Momentum or the Wasatch or the Front Climbing Club, which are great places, man. Then going to Little Cottonwood Canyon, it is a whole different world. I mean, you cannot compare those two. You can't climb 510 or whatever at those gyms and expect to go do it on slabs in Little Cottonwood. And people are getting over their heads. And we watched it this last summer. Can't remember the stats, but our Salt Lake Search and Rescue team, the last 2 summers, have increasingly seen more rescues, especially early in the season as it gets exciting to go outside.
Yeah, that's another can of worms too. Just hearing it called Los Angeles because it's becoming
Yeah.
so populated almost. But yeah, I mean, just the amount of people that step into those environments. It was almost a bummer to me, in its own way, because there's, with that increase in traffic, you obviously have a new culture that comes in, and what was interesting to me is watching the climbing scene get more a lot larger, is seeing the dynamic change where you were to show up at a climb and you're kind of respecting each other's space a little more, and now all of a sudden it turns into someone's roping into something that you're wanting to get into. They're crossing different bolts, going to a different anchor, and it's just like it turns into this mess where what once used to be a community that's really self-enforcing itself, it blows up so quickly where you don't have these kind of grandfathers of the sport able to pass this knowledge down of like, hey, you don't act like that here anymore. Um, yeah.
No, I think it's a really, really strong point, Nick. And we're there in some ways I won't say we're losing mentors, but I think the number of mentors to the population growth is not in line with each other, right? So, I mean, you can watch some of these kids go to the climbing gym as an example, and I mean, they're climbing 513 so fast. It seems to be the gym standard now.
Mm-hmm.
And then they go outside and they can climb way harder than folks. And it kind of gives you like, well, I'm a better climber. I must know more about this world. And it's far from the case when you go outside. It's kind of my example of going to Little Cottonwood, right? I've seen people climb 513 and just super strong on steep rock. And then you put them in a crack or a slab that's run out. And before you know it, you're kind of in a scary situation. But the other thing too, I mean, I could talk about climbing all day, from tick marks to leaving trash to, stacking pads and cutting down trees and bushes. And maybe now I'm more kind of what I said I didn't like is the media just highlighting those bad things. But
Mm-hmm.
on the flip side, you look at groups like Salt Lakers Climbers Alliance, the
Yep.
Access Fund. Our office has given them probably combined in the tune of $150,000 the last few years to build trails. And those two groups are coming with amazing volunteers, from young to old. And they're working hard to create phenomenal projects. And more importantly, because a lot of these projects are on public and private lands, they're pulling together all the right stakeholders and doing the project right and having full buy-in from everybody. So there's room for us to grow as a community in a lot of sports. But something else that was uplifting. I was on a panel. That panel I was with, it was with Backcountry magazine last week, where I was talking about was with Carolyn Gleich. We were sitting next to one of the Alta police department guys. I think his name is also Nick, actually. But he said that the backcountry users were some of the most respectful users in the canyon when it comes to coming up early, parking, abiding by closures, and that was really cool to hear. I mean, we need to hear that. And we need to be those stewards that those law enforcement folks look at us like, okay, these are good folks. We can trust them to do what they are supposed to be doing.
Mm-hmm.
So,
And that's what's so cool about what you're explaining about Utah as being one of the first states to really go through a lot of that, is seeing how much good is coming out of how people are interacting and working with each other when it's all of these different sports are starting to blow up. What I thought was interesting, to piggyback about what you were talking about with the rock climbing side of things, is in the winter seeing the backcountry touring blow up. And I remember just seeing like some pretty iffy moves that people were making in a lot of those scenarios, like what you're talking about with Caroline and how she went through the whole shooting gallery. There's some stuff where you're having to cramp on in and, ice axe through a lot of this stuff. And, it's just stuff where certain people look at it and they think that they can just go in there and that they're going to be invincible.
yeah,
What's blown my mind is how many accidents there haven't been in those situations. And I'm wondering if that's kind of attributed to a lot of the AVI certification stuff going on, and a lot of people reinforcing what they're learning in those situations, in those environments, or, like, what's, how can you attribute that, the lack of issues to a lot of those situations when you're having an increase in people doing them?
Well, that's actually kind of is really timely you asked that question. So, um, a couple weeks ago, so now this year alone, there's been 5 fatalities in Wasatch due to avalanches. And the
Mhm.
last 2 years, we've had zero.
Yep.
So I used to teach AVI safety and help represent for peeps in Utah, and so I'd go to a lot of ski patrols. So this was kind of near and dear to me, and I reached out to Chad Bracklesberg with the Utah Avalanche Center. We went skiing and we talked about, and Drew Hardesty. We said, hey, okay, let's talk about what's going on. Let's talk about the partnerships that have happened in the last few years and what's working really well. And I know some forecasters might not love it, but when they're sharing UDOT's AVI closures, when they're sharing snowpack videos, when they're
Hmm.
talking about what released, and Drew's there like, hey, this avalanche is 4 feet deep, 1,000 feet wide, ran whatever. I mean, I think those are kind of putting the fear and the power that can come in an avalanche into people's minds. Like, okay, I probably should pay attention. So I think there's a lot of saving grace there. I think UDOT's doing a good job doing control work. Um, and really but there's a lot of education left to do. I mean, I worked with a forecaster that unfortunately spoke to one of the victims this year a couple of weeks earlier, and
Hmm.
said, hey, it's this crazy snowpack this year, and a week, 2 weeks later, this person's no longer with us because they got in kind of one of these sticky situations, and what that's inspired us to do. And this happens tomorrow. So within about a 24-hour period, we collected all these voices together that are kind of key players in the avalanche world.
Hmm.
And we said, hey, let's create a resolution to make the first week of December Avalanche Awareness Month. And it's just one more tool and one more thing to inspire all of these groups to work together next year for the first week of December to talk about, we're going to be doing control work in Little Cottonwood and Big Cottonwood Canyon. It's going to slow down your drive. These are the reasons why we're doing it. Search and rescue teams don't want to do rescues because it costs them X number of dollars and they don't get reimbursed. And last but not least, the Utah Avi Center is like, hey, we're here to give you all the education you need. Pay attention. And I shouldn't say last but not least because there's so many more players in this world because we have Volet, we have Black Diamond, and they're making some of the best avalanche safety equipment in the world. There's not, outside of the financial constraints, which there's ways around that too with the universities and REI, you can go rent some of this stuff. But we have some of the best education, the best controllers, the best product in the world right here in the valley. So it's, we've got a lot of things going for us to help mitigate and to kind of get past some of those accidents or
Hmm.
avoid them.
Yeah, and the thing that struck me as crazy, as I started getting into more of that world, was after taking my Avi one, um, one, seeing a lot of, just looking at mountains differently in general. Like when you're
Mm-hmm.
when you're first exposed to it, you're looking at all these, these beautiful snow capped mountains, and you just kind of are awe inspired. And then as you go through Avi one, you look at that same mountain, and all you see is just the million different traps that you could get into, what the different snow's looking like, and where you could potentially walk where you're not going to get messed up. But
And then you go to the climbing gym instead.
yeah. But then the other thing that was interesting to me, was then trying to put a lot of that into practice and getting into situations where you're watching people make very quick decisions and understanding that a lot of times you can make bad choices and still come out okay. And I think that's, at least to me, the most difficult side of the backcountry touring aspect of a lot of things is you can you can make a shitty decision and walk out from it okay. And if you're not looking back on what you're doing and really forcing yourself to understand that you made a bad decision, you could make that again, and then that's the last time you're ever going to make it. So it's like it's this weird feedback thing that isn't happening, where you can be fine making the same decision that's bad 10 times in a row, and then the 11th time is the last time you ever make it.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think anybody that's been in the outdoor recreation world for a long time hasn't had an episode. I mean, we talk about Caroline Ski and the shooting gallery. I'm sure she had a day where she's like, "Well, that maybe I shouldn't have done that day," right? I
Hmm.
mean, especially when you have objectives, and your objectives are reliant on weather and conditions and the people you're around. I mean, that can really throw a wrench in the mix. And I used to do a lot of Avi safety stuff. I think there's that false hope or that halo effect that, oh, I'm with Tom. He used to teach Avi safety. He's probably got this down. Or I'm with somebody from the forecast center. Like I'm totally safe. They're never going to make a mistake. But some of the biggest accidents I've seen and the most memorable are with professionals. They're with guides that guides maybe have done something wrong, or their clients did something out of whack, or they were professional climbers and they got in terrain that, the objective was maybe more inspiring than looking at the terrain and being mindful of their surroundings. And, a lot of good people aren't with us anymore because of those decisions. But kind of back to, the collaboration from the UDOTs of the world and the ski resorts and the Utah Avalanche Center, at least when it comes to Avi safety. I mean, their collaboration is making us safer as a community, and hopefully they'll continue to improve on that. And yeah, we got to get past as a community that halo effect and, skiing the biggest line because we can. I mean, like you said, you might ski it 10 times and the 11th time you're done. So.
Hmm. Yeah, it's an interesting like psychological thing that comes into play there, especially when what you're talking about with being with someone that you feel is more experienced and they're either making a choice that you're not necessarily aware of, or you're talking through something and their decision is something that you might not necessarily make, and you're seeing them as the one that has more experience, and you start to kind of question yourself on that. And it's almost better to just step away from it at that point than, just kind of blindly accept what someone else is doing. But it's definitely a crazy world. Um, so to piggyback off of that, what you mentioned, the avalanche thing kind of being something that's come up recently as something that you are working with people to reinforce and make sure that everyone's staying safe. What other issues are coming up, and what are the pros and cons of a lot of those different things that are playing out right now?
In terms of legislation,
Yeah, legislation or maybe potential difficulties with, just the absolute boom in how many people are coming to these outdoor places currently.
yeah, no. So both great questions, a little bit different in terms of legislation specific. This is a really good year for Utah. I mean, you're hearing so many pro public land things, and the beauty about it, even in DC, is these public land changes are happening in what a lot of Utahns will say the right way, and even the Outdoor Industry Association will say, "Hey, these changes need to happen through Congress." But over the last few years, we've seen Congress not really agree on much. So to see
Hmm.
them agree on this public lands package the other day was truly phenomenal. Some people are not happy, some people are overjoyed, but that's collaboration, and that's how those things work. But Utah, we did quite well. But here locally, there's a couple things that are phenomenal. As I said, one of our objectives is to inspire Utahns, especially youth, on the benefits of recreation. And what was really motivational and great to see is we helped create a bill in our office, and the woman that helped create it works here for me in this office. Her name's Rose Smith, and she just graduated from the University of Utah about a year ago. And while she's working on her master's project, she said, "Hey Tom, I'd like to do a kids program, kind of promoting kids and recreation." I said, "Well, let's run with it." We got approval from Governor Herbert, and make a long story short, this bill, which is, oh gosh, where is it at? It's HCR 4, House Concurrent Resolution 4. It's called Every Kid Outdoors. Basically says, I watched so many committees go through, and every time I went through a committee, it was a unanimous yes. People were really thrilled. And it's a document that says, hey, our kids in Utah should be able to take advantage of these 10 activities, and do them pretty affordably and close to home. And a lot of people would guess, oh, skiing must be one of the 10 activities. And skiing's not one of the activities, because those that have been to ski resorts, it's not cheap to take a family of 5, let alone one
Hmm.
person sometimes. This one is the line for skiing is enjoy the greatest snow on earth. So that could be kids going sledding or training to be a downhill racer at the Olympics, at the Olympic Legacy Center. So that's a really great one. We're seeing a couple other ones. Of course, the avalanche one starts tomorrow. We saw another resolution about the importance of outdoor recreation to businesses in Utah and having quick access, because it's probably one of the best recruiting tools we have when trying to bring people from out of state or people to businesses, and just say, hey, you could be skiing before work or at lunch or whatever it might be. So those are the things that are kind of happening nationally and statewide, but it's phenomenal. We have 2 weeks left in the Utah session, so a lot could change still. So
Yeah, it's awesome that you mentioned bringing kids more into it, just because for my time in Utah, I always thought about how there was a significant portion of the population that is living next to this just incredible range with incredible access and potentially doesn't spend any time even thinking about it or in a lot of those places. And it's cool to see that there's a program in place for people to bring more of an appreciation to those places and then keep that with them as they grow up. Because I think it affects people differently when that's something that's at the forefront of who they are and what they believe in when they're making decisions into adulthood.
yeah, kids by the stats are watching TV for 7.5 hours a day these days, or have a monitor in front of them.
It's
And
another great point.
I mean, it's really sad because a lot of it, I think, is a contributing factor, because we are 8th in the nation for youth suicide rates. I mean, we are through the roof. It just should never be that way. And so kind of with that as some inspiration, there's another bill. It's SB 222, and it's the Children's Outdoor Recreation Program. So it's another layer on the Every Kid Outdoors initiative. The initiative says, here's what we believe in. And this Children's Outdoor Recreation Program, if it passes, would give $100,000 next year to help fund youth education programs to get kids out recreating. And to your point, recreating with good stewards. So hopefully learning to use the land and to respect it, and to understand that more people are going to come after them too.
Mm-hmm. And so what you kind of hit on there was more of a unanimous vote in terms of people wanting that program to happen and coming together to work through a lot of this stuff. Are there specific instances or topics that people are more divided on currently within what you're seeing?
Right now, when it comes to recreation in Utah, nothing is, excuse me, nothing is jumping out that they're really divisive. There's definitely some disagreements. If you look at the Central Wasatch Commission, which is for the most part, a really great plan. I mean, again, it's compromise. People are giving and taking here, but they're trying to work towards a common goal, which is maybe one of the most impactful public lands area when it comes to access from a big population. So that's one. You'll see some some debates, but really respectful. You've seen some debates in Utah, and they typically make the papers where somebody says, hey, we should own every single piece of federal land that's in the state. And, a lot of people are not on the same page. And unfortunately, I think what happens in the media is they take that loudest, most extreme voice, and that's the story that gets told. But you don't hear the voice of so many other people saying, hey, no, we think they're public lands for a reason. But, some of those folks that are saying that they should be state lands, they do have a pedestal to stand on, because there's some really old federal laws that said Utah was supposed to get lands back, year after year, whatever it is. But now we're dating back to some policy that was written in, 1910. I don't know. So, but these days things have been pretty darn good. And I'm going to knock on wood, because it's nice to not be on a public lands debate right now.
Yeah. So to go back to some of that, specifically Bears Ears, like what are the different voices that were coming forward in terms of how that was all playing out, and what are some of the misconceptions in terms of where potentially money was going or who was getting what, and how that was negatively affecting the different parties involved?
Well, I think what you need to look at for a lot of rural Utahns, and even folks at the Capitol and the governor, they watched Grand Staircase get declared from Clinton. And, I was before my time, but the story was, he did it from a golf course in Arizona for somewhere on a vacation, and wasn't really here and didn't get a lot of public input. And there might be some people that were around at the time said, heck yeah, there was input. And then Sally Jewell came out for Bears Ears and did a ton more work that's ever been done. And we were all rooting for something to happen through Congress. But at the end of Obama's tenure, he said, hey, we're going to use the Antiquities Act, and he did it. And to a lot of people in the state, I was like, no, that is not the right way to use the Antiquities Act. And some people will say that there was an abuse of Antiquities Acts because there's a lot of sagebrush out there that doesn't need to be protective, and that, you know, no one has inventoried that 1.5 million acres. And what I think is nice about this public lands package is it wasn't the Antiquities Act. And surprisingly enough, it was Congress coming together with a lot of local support. Again, not everybody was happy, but the vast majority sure seemed to be happy. And at the end of the day, I think the House vote the other day was 163 to 62. So the lion's share of people in Congress said this is a good thing. So that's what I think, that's the biggest takeaway, is we want to make sure we have feedback from everybody and let Congress make that choice for Americans as opposed to one person.
Gotcha.
So, yeah.
Yeah, interesting. Because it seemed like, you know, for a while there, you were just seeing so many different opinions. And what I think can get difficult with what you mentioned was um, different media outlets potentially pushing certain stories forward more often than others. And it can be difficult just because it seems like um, you're not really able to tell from an outside perspective what pieces of that conversation need to hold more weight compared to others. And so you're just seeing this whirlwind of these different opinions coming forward, and it turns into kind of just this muddled mess of like what's right. You know, especially for people that are outside of Utah and have never experienced what Bears Ears is, or Grand Staircase, or anything down there.
Yeah.
And you know, now all of a sudden social media is giving a voice to people that don't necessarily know every piece of the conversation and what's actually playing out.
Yeah. I think what we needed ideally is we needed Obama to have another year for Congress to work through that. And ideally, in the perfect world, come to a better conclusion on what happens down there. But, you know, history is what it is, and we have what we have now, and we're working with it. And, you know, where we're at as an Office of Outdoor Recreation, the Office of Tourism in the state, we're working closely with BLM. We're helping to recommend people that can help create recreation and management plans down there. And we'll see. I mean, that still could change. A lot of things could still change down there. But what no one can take away is there's a lot of beautiful places down there, but there's also resources too for extraction. And we just have to balance out where's extraction going to go and where's recreation and conservation going to go. And you know what's tough to stomach sometimes, if you look at the sheer stats, you compare what states have the most public lands, what states have maybe compared to the most extraction or oil and gas leases. I think you'll find that Utah has less oil and gas leases than a lot of other states and way more public lands. And, you know, once you really start looking at the detail of the landscapes and what's actually there, some states are better than others when it comes to oil and gas, and some states are better than others when it comes to recreation conservation. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's interesting because whenever I talk to people about more of the sustainability side of, usually it starts within business, but it can obviously come in. It bleeds into a lot of these places that we're going to actually recreate in. Is that it takes a lot of these fossil fuels in order to get down to some of these places, and you're
Yeah.
like, it's there's always a gray area of like a trade off between I need to use these resources in order to appreciate these places, and now I'm trying to save them and cut back on these resources. And there's always some other piece in play of like, you can't just pretend that it's siloed and that we're going to save this specific thing because it means that something else is going to be affected by that, whether that's, you know, what you just mentioned with more of the fossil fuel side of things, or potentially like people that are living down there that have been on the land for longer, or you know, the Native American side of what all is going on with that. And it just seems like you're just you're almost at a rock and a hard place because you're constantly trying to weigh um, each of these different things and how it's all going to be affected by a change in policy.
Yeah, I mean, when you look at a lot of the places here in Utah, there's a lot of folks that really need to be taken into the consideration when you're talking about managing lands, right? You know, there's without a doubt in southern Utah a lot of Native Americans that have a right to the land. There's a lot of people that might have lived there for a long time, generation after generation, either ranching or farming or whatever it might be, and it probably newer to the scene are the recreationalists in the grand scheme of things, right?
Hmm.
And everybody kind of wants their piece of the pie, and balancing that out's tough. And to your point, we're all driving down there. I mean, no one's on a hovercraft or not using gas or oil products. And I like the Made in America thing. I think it's great. And when I'm taking my rack of 50 cams to Indian Creek, I'm pretty psyched that they're made in Salt Lake now, right? Seeing some of these things reshored here is a cool thing. But we'll see if this happens. But there's been talk about funding the Land, Water, and Conservation Fund through domestic oil and gas leases. So it does two things. One helps to fund the maintenance backlog. I mean, that's what it's for. It's for the maintenance backlog, not LWCF. Helps fund the maintenance backlog, but it also means more extraction on U.S. soil. So, there's some give and take there.
Yeah, and it's been interesting to be a part of the outdoor industry and to see where people are more willing to have conversations and where that sort of thing just kind of gets cut off. It's a bummer to go into a lot of grassroots organizations and see people being so gung-ho about wanting to save these places, but unwilling to take into account the fact that there are a lot of other moving parts, when it seems like we're all trying to work toward the same thing. It stinks to see people get so bent out of shape and being unwilling to take other viewpoints into consideration when a lot of this stuff's going on.
Oh yeah, some people come into these conversations cranked up to 11, right? They're like, this is what I want to do. I'm going to
Great
do
way
it.
to put it.
And once they turn it down, I think the Central Wasatch Commission is a great example of folks that have for a long time debated similar things, but almost every meeting I've ever been to, they're very professional and cordial and talking through things. And they might get frustrated, but they're handling things the way professionals should handle them. And that's really cool to see.
Hmm.
So
Yeah. So, what you had come to this podcast from the Capitol? What does that sort of environment look like for you when you're going into that sort of process? What is it? How does that all move along, and how are people trying to work through that? Like more of the legalese side of things, or what people aren't seeing behind closed doors.
yeah, a lot of people see something win a vote. And if you say it's unanimous on a vote, a lot of people leave some of those hearings think, hey, it passed. We have whatever we wanted. But people don't realize that it's a process. Like you have 3 votes in the House, maybe, 3 votes in the Senate, maybe, and then it still has to go to the governor to get signed, right? So there's so many paths for a bill to run through before it's approved. And you know, I don't maybe I'm dating myself, but there's that old song, "I'm a Bill on Capitol Hill," right?
Yep.
I mean, it's a process that everybody should see. I mean, tomorrow morning, I don't know when this airs, but we're doing this Avalanche Awareness Month at 7:49 a.m. in the House Natural Resources Committee in the Capitol Building, room 445. Come watch it. I mean, people need to come see these things and watch the process because your voice really matters, and your voice matters in a much bigger way than people recognize. And some
Hmm.
people, they might take a template letter and sign it and send it off to their legislator. And that might have worked a few years ago, but it doesn't work as much anymore. Legislators want to see a personalized letter, a story, something that speaks to who you are and you're a constituent of their district and what you want to see out of their votes. And that goes a long way. And that's kind of what I was just doing when I raced down here. We're talking about how to use some funding, recognizing that these are taxpayer dollars. We need to be as responsible as possible with these things, and we need to help this bill do that. And that's what we do. But myself personally and the Office of Outdoor Recreation, we work for Governor Herbert, and that's the line we toe. So we are anything you see us promoting, it's because Governor Herbert believes in it as well. And other things you might not see us at, it's maybe not because we don't personally do it, but we work for the state, and so we're kind of towing those lines. So I think it's good for people to get engaged because there might be an outdoor bill that I really support that may or not been presented to the governor, but we need other people to come support it, because all I can do is educate you on it. I can't lobby you to vote one way or another.
Hmm.
So
Gotcha. So that's a pretty good segue into kind of wrapping up here, just because we're getting a little bit closer to the full hour and a half that I like to try and stick under. But um, so if someone's really passionate about a certain topic, or if they're just wanting to be more involved with what sorts of issues are at the forefront, what's the best way for one, for them to get involved, but two, also to voice their opinion? Just because I feel like there's, at least in my perspective, I see a lot of people coming out to protest nowadays, and to me it seems like it's a more beneficial way to go about working towards something that you want, uh, by spending money in certain places, or by voting with your dollar versus going out to, um, I guess from my perspective, maybe I'm a little more jaded about it, but yell about something as compared to putting something more into action.
yeah. Well, there's a couple things there. I think you're exactly right. If you go to some rallies, it's cool going to some rallies and seeing the mass amount of people there, but try to find one common message is a really hard thing a lot of times these days. Everybody's kind of screaming different things, and that's, you really want people to be unified in that. But for people to get fully engaged, I'll tell you a couple things. One, you want to go to le.utah.gov, and that's the state website. You can find bills from every single session. Right now, if you want to find, just type in outdoor. If you type in outdoor and click on the bills tab, it's going to show you every single bill that uses the word outdoor. And that's a quick way to scan, like, hey, does this matter to me? Should I really be in attendance and be a voice there? So that's one thing to do. And you mentioned the term kind of voting with your dollars. For all of us that are traveling to rural communities to go recreate, don't fill up your car here and your cooler and everything in your hometown and just use that as a drive through town. Stop, buy some things, let people know why you're there, make friends with them, and just say, hey, recreation's important to me in your community. Thanks for being here, or whatever it might be. Because if you just drive through, they're going to recognize, hey, we might not want these regulations here because they don't do anything but wear out our roads and they don't leave any tax dollars.
Hmm.
So that's a big one, because I think it's like anywhere you go, whether it's here or Europe. I think when you get into those rural communities, people are awesome. They're maybe moving a little slower. They want to talk. They're curious on why you're there. They're engaged, and they're excited that you're spending some money in their town. So that's, if I can say one thing in closing, that to be, is get engaged with the communities that you care about.
Cool. So would there be anything else, like you mentioned, being able to go to see more of the Utah side of things? If someone's wanting to do that within their own state and it's outside of Utah, are there ways that they can try and go pursue more of that thing within their own state, other than obviously what you're mentioning, being more a little bit more engaged within smaller communities?
Yeah, so that le.utah.gov is our state legislator website. Every state has one. If you're in Utah, this one's been really well recognized around the country for being easy to use, and you can track bills. You can do that federally too. Like, just click a bill to track it. It'll send you emails, texts, whatever you want. So do that. If there's an area that matters to you that's important, look for friends of. Look for friends of Joshua Tree, friends of Arches, friends of Yosemite. If there's an activity that you love, look for the advocacy group. Like here in Salt Lake Climbers Alliance is good. There's a great Salt Lake Rowing Company. There's a bunch of cycling clubs. Just get engaged with those groups. And a lot of times we don't have 50 hours a week like I do to just focus on these things. You have to get attached to a group that you believe in, that's kind of has your voice in mind, and your money might help them to do what you think is right. So, because
Gotcha.
you'll never pay attention to all the bills. Even I can't pay attention to all of them because there's so many.
Hmm. So it
So
sounds like a piece of what you're recommending is trying to amplify your voice in any way that you can. Just because you mentioned trying to write in to talk about a specific issue, you might get heard to a degree, but not necessarily as much as if you're coming with more voices behind you, as like, this is the single thing that we care about, and this is why.
exactly, you can get that unified voice with a group like Bike Utah. But I wish I knew what it was, but it was Laura on Radioactive the other day down here in Salt Lake. She had a guest on that was really well spoken about, hey, you need to write your own letter and tell a story, or call them and tell your story, or go to a committee hearing and tell your story. And they need to hear that. They need to know, oh wow, that is Tom from my area. He's a constituent and I respect his voice and I've seen him before. So
Awesome.
anyways.
Well, sweet. I appreciate it. We're gonna have to get on and do another one of these in the future and catch up on what all's been going down. Just because it sounds like it's starting off to be an awesome year for Utah, and I hope it continues to go that way.
Cross your fingers, 2 more weeks of the session. Hopefully we're still saying the same thing in 2 weeks.
Crossing for that and for more snow.
Exactly. It's supposed to come this weekend. I'm hopefully going to ski tomorrow afternoon. So
That sounds great. Awesome. Well, I appreciate it. Thanks for hanging in there with me with that half-hour long technical issue there at the beginning.
the computers work for us.
We'll make them. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Nick. I appreciate the time.
Thanks. I appreciate it. Yeah. Have a great night.
You too.